Hi everybody, welcome to It's All Write with Suzette. I'm Suzette Martinez Standring, I'm your host, and today we are going to talk about the craft of writing from the perspective of Emily Ross, and she is the author of Half in Love with Death. Gosh, I love that title. And her book, Half in Love with Death, is a finalist in the young adult novel in the International Thriller Writers 2016 Thriller Awards. It has also won a 2014 Massachusetts Cultural Council Finalist Award in Fiction. She is the editor and contributor to Dead Darlings, a website dedicated to the craft of novel writing. She's a perfect guest today. So I want to welcome Emily Ross.
Hello.
It is so great to have you on the show today. And your book, Half in Love with Death, young adult novel, it is based on a true crime that happened in the 1960s. So, Emily, I'm all ears. Tell us about this crime that you based your novel on.
It's actually inspired by a crime that took place in the mid-60s. It's the case of a serial killer, Charles Schmidt, also known as the Pied Piper of Tucson. And in Tucson, in the mid-60s, he murdered 3 teenage girls and buried them in the desert. 2 of them were sisters. One of them was 17-year-old Gretchen Fritz. That was his girlfriend, and her 13-year-old sister, Wendy. It was a horrific crime. But one of the things that drew me to it was that he was a very interesting man and not what I would think of as your typical serial killer, if there is such a thing. He was extremely charming. He was handsome. He had many friends, most of them teens, and lots of girlfriends. There were theories that some of the teens in Tucson at the time knew about his crimes and kept it his secret. So I was intrigued by him as a man that sort of hid a really dark side behind a charming facade. And I was intrigued by the story of the 2 sisters, really moved by it. And in fact, I found out about this crime from my sister. I was trying to write this novel, for really struggling with getting started and finding a story. And she suggested to me that I turn to a true crime for inspiration, which is something I never would have thought to do. And she said, by the way, I have a crime for you. And she shared with me that when she was 12 years old, she had actually been obsessed with this crime. There was a sensational article in Life magazine about it. And she had a copy of the magazine, and she would keep it under her bed and take it out and read it in secret. Now, I thought I was close to my sister, but I never knew about this, and I never heard about this crime. So once I dug into it, I realized I wanted to use it in some way in my novel. I think it's more inspired by than based on, because the novel actually turned out to be quite different.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, just a little bit about this true crime. Schmidt, how old was he when he was committing these serial murders?
He was 23.
He was 23, and his victims, they were teenage girls.
Right.
And whatever happened to him?
He was eventually convicted of the murder of the 2 sisters because one of his friends actually became concerned that he was going to harm a girl that he was interested in.
Wow.
And he was so concerned that he finally went to the police. And then the case sort of unraveled. And once the case of the 2 sisters, they found the bodies. The earlier crime, the earlier teenage girl that he murdered, unraveled as well. And he was convicted of all 3 murders and sentenced to death. But then the death penalty was, I think, eliminated in Arizona. So he had a life sentence, but he was actually murdered in prison.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, yeah.
Now, your book is done from the voice of Caroline, the younger sister. Her older sister, Jess, goes missing, and it sounds like Caroline always had a little bit of a crush on her sister's boyfriend.
Yeah.
Right, Tony. Now, I don't want to give away any spoilers, so maybe you could, you talk about how your book is very different from the crime itself. It's inspired by that event. But tell us a little bit about it.
Well, the story, I did borrow the setting. The story takes place in Tucson, and it takes place in 1965. I also took the time frame, which was very influential in shaping my story. But it is told from the point of view of a 15-year-old girl who's actually not a person that is actually has any role in the actual crime.
Right.
And what happens is her older sister, Jess, goes missing. And when that happens, her whole world is really turned upside down. She feels like she's disappeared in her own family. Her parents are drinking a lot and blaming each other. They're not finding her sister. As was really common in the 60s, the police are just assuming, well, Jess is a runaway, and they're not trying very hard to find her. And really the only person who's talking to Caroline and seems to care as much as she does about finding Jess is Jess's older, handsome boyfriend, Tony. He says to her, you know, we'll find her together. Anything is possible if you believe. And she desperately, desperately wants to believe him. And she also has feelings for him. And there's just one problem. He's also a suspect in the case. But nobody else is finding her sister, so she follows him into this world of runaways and flower children. And sort of as the story unfolds, she's torn between her doubts and sort of her growing strong feelings and trust in him.
I think you do a terrific job of capturing her voice. When you write in first person from her perspective, the reader is really immersed in her 15-year-old character. Now, it's a young adult novel, but it really appeals, it has a wide appeal to adults and all of that. But what made you write it from a young adult novel perspective, even though it really does appeal to a wide readership?
I actually didn't make a decision to write a young adult novel, but I made a decision to write from the point of view of a 15-year-old girl. I was really drawn to the idea of writing from the point of view of someone who's somewhat innocent, who doesn't see the whole picture. I thought of my own teen years and what I didn't see and what I didn't know and what it was like to be in a teen in sort of that tumultuous decade. So I love teen voices. I love sort of the recklessness and intensity of adolescence. So I knew I wanted to write from the point of view of a teenage girl, and I just started to hear her voice. And then when I completed the novel, I sort of heard from agents, well, this is a young adult novel. But I actually originally wrote it, you know, with it sort of an adult audience in mind.
And when you were creating Tony, I think that is an effort at craftsmanship, because you're capturing his charisma, but at the same time, you're trying to convey this dangerousness. So how did you go about writing from that point of view, a young man?
That was actually probably the most challenging part of the novel. When I originally wrote it, I used a lot of Charles Schmidt, and readers I had who were reading it said, you know, he's not attractive, he's creepy, we're not buying it, and he wasn't coming to life for me as a character.
Oh, I see.
So what I did is I really had to step away from my notes, and all I really used from the crime is I used a lot of photographs of Schmidt, because he is very interesting looking, and he had sort of these bewitching, blue eyes. All the photographs are black and white, but you can tell they were blue. So I sort of just looked at the photographs and sort of conjured a character. And then Tony started talking to me and coming to life on the page and doing things that were his own. But it was very challenging to write a character that was at once dark but also attractive, and has, I don't believe anyone is all evil, and he has good aspects to his character, and then he has aspects that are not good.
Can you give us some examples of some lovable elements? I mean, we can understand the physical attraction, but you know, all about writing is always about showing or immersing us into that character. Can you give us some of the props you might have used, or some some traits to show that he is lovable and worthy of trust by this 15-year-old girl?
Well, one of the things is he has a lot of friends, and he's good to his friends. He has one of his friends is an unwed teen with a baby, and he helps her take care of the baby. In terms of Caroline, he's actually genuinely really interested in getting to know her in a way that no one else has. And he writes poetry, which is actually something I pulled from Schmidt, because Schmidt did write poetry, actually pretty
Interesting.
good poetry, which was very disturbing and interesting to me. So Caroline writes poetry. That's the one thing she does that sort of makes her feel real and different. And Tony does too, and they genuinely bond over that. It's not false.
Mm-hmm. And what about the parents?
Her parents, you know, some people have said to me they don't really like the parents, that they're irresponsible parents, that they drink too much, they don't pay that much attention to
They're
their
very
kids.
real to the readers, to the point where they're criticizing the parents.
Yeah, I have a lot of people really don't like her mother, and I think that's fine. I think that people today don't understand some of the differences in parents in the 60s.
Absolutely.
It was a time where parents actually, although there was this huge generation gap, they had a freer hand with their kids. They didn't know where they were. There were no cell phones. There was no texting. Kids went off, and they did a lot on their own, and parents had their own lives. Mm-hmm. So it's a very different dynamic, and I tried to convey that.
This was all before the child abductions, too, became... brought these kind of things to national attention.
Exactly, yes.
Right, because
yes.
you and I both grew up in that period
Yep.
of time. And so I can really remember, even as being a young mother myself, you know, in the 1970s, how much more freedom you just assumed children could have.
Right,
back
exactly.
then.
That's true. I mean, kids walked, my God, they went to school, they walked to school, they walked home, they went out after school, and we didn't have like CNN.com telling us every day that something horrible has happened to a child somewhere. It wasn't in the, you know, it was happening, but it wasn't in the press as much, yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah.
In a little bit, we're going to return and we're going to talk to Emily Ross more about her process in writing Half in Love with Death. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. Hi, welcome back. I'm Suzette Standring, and we are interviewing Emily Ross, author of Half in Love with Death. And it's been quite the journey for you to write this book. How long did it take you to write this book?
It took me probably about 7 years.
7 years?
Just to write it, yeah.
Wow. Now, you know, in a perverse way, I find that so encouraging because I've been working on a novel since 2003, and
Yeah.
sometimes I wonder if it'll ever happen. But I was telling you earlier that I think that writing a novel, your crime thriller, is a very high art form because fiction takes a lot of imagination, and you're really weaving scenes and emotions that bring the reader in. I mean, you're weaving it out of whole cloth, even though you're basing it on a factual case. Now, I know that you are an editor and contributor to Dead Darlings, a website dedicated to discussing the craft of novel writing. Mm-hmm. So, can you could you share some writing tips that you applied in your process?
Yes.
To make all these things come alive?
I mean, one of the reasons it took a long time is writing a novel is complex, but it also, at the time I was writing it, I had a full-time job, I worked in IT, I had 2 teenage children, so I wasn't able to give the novel a lot of time. And one of the things I discovered is near the end, when I had close to a finished draft, I did this program called the Novel Incubator that Grub Street has.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Which is an intensive novel program where 10 novelists work basically for a year on their novels with an instructor. Each novel is read in its entirety twice. You go through a lot of revisions. And one of the things I discovered, because that was such an intense program, I had to give my book a lot more time. In fact, by the end of the program, I had practically memorized my novel, and I realized that with a work as long as a novel, you almost have to have it in your life every day. I mean, even if you're working and you don't have a lot of time, you know, spend a few minutes in the morning, spend time on the train, you know, think about it while you're cooking dinner, because you have to keep the story in your head all the time. You have to give it time. It's a big story. You have to give it time. And then also you have to be willing to revise it over and over again until it's doing what it needs to do. You have to be willing to listen to what other people tell you, to listen to that little inner voice that says something's not working, and keep going at it again and again.
You know, you bring up something that I'd like to address. And first of all, I want to give a shout out to Mo Hanley, who is where I met you, because in her home she has these book signings and author talks, and she invites people from the neighborhood and the community.
She's amazing.
And that's how I heard about you, and I was really intrigued by the half in love with death, and so that's where I heard you talk and everything. You shared a really interesting story in your process where you were told to cut out 100 pages.
Yes.
Can you imagine 100 pages? Because I think it was an agent was interested, but required you
It was actually an editor,
It was an editor. Can you tell us about that painful experience?
I actually had an agent, and I was on submission, which means my agent was sending my book out to editors. So I felt I had a very polished novel, and it was basically done. It had been through many edits.
How many words was it at that point?
It was about over 90,000 words.
90,000 words, okay.
About 335 pages. I remember that because it's a painful number for me. And the agent got feedback from an editor from a very good press saying she really liked the book, but she wanted me to revise it and resubmit it. And all she wanted me to do was take 100 pages out of the first 150, which
all she wanted you to do.
Which is huge.
Oh, just a little. 150. Wow.
It was,
a third of your book, just about.
It was a third of the book and almost the entire beginning, because the beginning, was 150 pages and now it was going to be 50 pages. And so, but I agreed to do it, one, because it kind of attracted me, the idea, like, can I do it? It was a challenge. And I also had been reading a lot of young adult fiction, and young adult fiction is very tight, very tautly written, and I felt that this would be a challenge to learn how to do that. So I did it. I had some help. My agent helped me. I went through all my scenes.
Wow.
And anytime there were two scenes that did anything remotely alike, they had to become one scene. I eliminated a character. It was probably the scariest writing thing I'd ever done because I had felt my book was done and I was really afraid maybe I was ruining it. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. And then after all of that?
Then it took me 3 months to do that, and my agent submitted it back to the editor that had asked for it, and another 3 months went by. This is why it takes a long time to get a book out there. And then the agent got back and just said no, and I was absolutely devastated.
Of course you were.
I was like, you had to scrape me off the floor. I was so upset.
Wow.
And then my agent said, well, no, you have a much stronger book now, and we're not giving up, and we're going to go out with it again. And the first editor that got it took it.
Very good.
It happened to be Merit Press.
You did not second guess yourself and say, I should have just left it all in. You didn't.
I knew it was a better book. I knew it was a better book. I knew it was stronger. It had really sharpened my story. So no, I didn't. I just felt like, now what do I have to do? It was hard. Yeah.
Wow.
Right. Yeah.
That is amazing. Now, what's your writing process, Emily? Are you a morning person, or do you write at a particular time of day?
I prefer to write in the morning. I kind of have more energy then. By the end of the day, I'm kind of tired. So I kind of start in the morning and go as long as I can, or as much time I have. The other thing, though, is a lot of times when I'm writing in the morning, I'm either I look at what I wrote the day before, I do a little revision, I move forward, but I don't get my plot ideas in the morning. I get my plot ideas at like 4 a.m., which is very inconvenient. But I've learned I just get up, I type them into my iPhone.
Muse is whispering in your ear at 4 a.m.
Yep, that's when my muse whispers, but I do most of my plotting in the middle of the night. And then when I wake up and I start in the morning, I sort of have an idea.
Now, here's a question for you. Do you know what obviously in this crime situation book, you know that, but generally speaking, are you the kind of writer that you know how your book is going to end and you write towards that? Or are you the kind of writer that goes along until an ending suggests itself? People do it both ways.
I know, and both ways work, actually. I wish I was the kind of writer that started my novel with an outline and kind of had a very clear picture of how to proceed. I'm not. I'm just not. I did have a very general sense of the ending that helped me, but I'm kind of like driving in the dark, and I just see a little bit ahead, and then I see a little bit more ahead, and I tend to get more creative ideas that way. That's just how I work. But especially with a mystery, it's very difficult to write it
Yes,
that
with
way.
a mystery.
Yeah.
Now, when you were going along this twisty-turny road of writing your piece, your book, what kind of surprises came up, perhaps about the characters or the way you were going to approach something that kind of happened during the process that you did not foresee but ended up being a great idea? You know, we're talking about the muse that whispers in your ear at 4 a.m.
There are a lot of small things. I mean, perhaps the biggest thing is I had originally written the novel with the idea that it was going to end in the desert. It was going to end in the desert. That was where the climactic scene was going to be. And it didn't turn out that way. I don't want to give away
no spoilers.
The ending, but I ended up, the really climactic scene of the novel is in a completely different place. That was sort of a decision I made late. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in the last few minutes that we have here on the show, what kind of traits or qualities are very helpful if you're going to be a young adult writer?
Well, I think you have to really like teens, and you have to be able to get into the teen voice and the teen mindset, because if you write about a teen as an adult and get kind of judgmental, it's not going to work. You have to really be able to immerse yourself in teens and like this. And I think one of the wonderful things about young adult writing is it's just so creative and almost anything goes, and it's very freeing. But you do have to be interested in the issues that face teens, and their vulnerabilities and love, and there's some more of the darker things, substance abuse and all those things.
What I loved what you said earlier is that you can still recall the intensity of those teen years. I have this 2-cent theory, I have this 2-cent theory that no matter what our chronological age is, we're a certain age in our mind.
Absolutely.
How old are you, Emily?
I'm actually about 13 or 14.
13
there
or
are
14,
years you get
yes.
stuck in, and
I love
still
it.
remember them.
You capture her voice so beautifully. In my mind, I think I'm 18.
Yeah,
Then I'm walking around looking in the mirror going, you are not 18.
Exactly. It's so devastating.
Now, how can we find your book?
My book it's available on Amazon. It's available in some of the local bookstores like Porter Square Books and Newtonville Books. It's available on Barnes & Noble online. So,
Now, what's your website?
I have a website, emilyrosswrites.com, and there's
emilyrosswrites.com.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And we're going to post that on the show along with your email and everything. And I understand that your that Half in Love with Death is a finalist in the International Thriller Writers 2016 Thriller Awards. And when does the winner get announced?
They have a convention called Thriller Fest in July, which
Thriller
I am
Fest.
going to and really looking forward to. I love the International Thriller Writers, fantastic organization, and they will announce the winner there.
And for people who are interested in visiting Dead Darlings, is it deaddarlings.com?
Yes. Yeah.
They can visit and learn a lot about writing.
It's a wonderful site. We have a lot of guest writers that come in, and 3 times a week, actually twice a week or 3-4 times a week, we'll have a different piece on some aspect of novel writing.
Well, Emily, it was such a pleasure to have you on the show. Good luck with your very successful, already successful book, Half in Love with Death. And it was so wonderful to meet you at Mo Hanley's house. That was
Same here.
That was really a great forum for local writers. And Emily lives in Quincy.
Yes, yeah.
And so we're looking forward to hearing more about you in the months to come and more of your accomplishments. Right now, I want to thank you for being on the show, and thank you for tuning in to It's All Right with Suzette, and we'll see you next time.